Is this thing on? Welcome back to Big Mouth and fancy seeing you here, and you are very welcome, my friends, and especially my enemies. Come in, sit down, no touching. I don't do the touching. I just wrote a thread on Twitter about the dceu and what happened with Snyder and all of that, and I want to read it out to you because there's always a balance to my thinking. As much as I love Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, my highest priority is towards DC and its characters. But ultimately, I want all fans to enjoy these films. Hardline DC fans, the mainstream audience, people who enjoyed Snyder's DCEU. I want everyone to come in and get what they want. And that's always hard to please everyone. But I believe there's so much potential in DC content because it's such a varied, beautiful universe. So this is what I wrote, right? You can't build a film franchise on 40 foundations, and that's how the DCEU started. I love Man of Steel and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. But Chris Nolan was never committed to mold a franchise, so he brought in Zack and Goyer to do it. That, of course, that made the studio nervous. The studio wanted Nolan to mould the franchise, nobody else, but he kept on passing it around to others. Others that would never create a franchise for the many and big DC Comics fans. As a company, WB knew DC had the potential to attract everyone. I totally agree with WB Entertainment plan to get Nolan to run the franchise. The man's a genius, but instead of being honest and passing it through lack of commitment and motivation, he kept on digging a deeper hole for the franchise. By that time, the franchise was at Suicide Squad, and the broader audience, the consumers you need, wasn't responding well. So the studio was in an impossible situation. So they brought in Geoff Johns, who turned things around with Wonder Woman. Now, before everyone gets into me and say, oh yeah, Zack was involved with that, he was. And, he helped Patty with a lot of the choreography, so it looked in line with the rest of the DCEU, and it was great. But it was Geoff Johns who brought in a lot of the people who worked, especially the writer of the movie, right? So he had a lot to do with the success of this film. It's no coincidence the differences between Wonder Woman, Man of Steel, and Batman v Superman. Right, we go on with this thread. But Justice League was on the horizon, and the studio was between a rock and a hard place. Snyder's plan was going to divide audiences. Again, his rewrite of Justice League didn't make them feel any better. They'd already steadied the ship with Wonder Woman, but Justice League was already shot. But in truth, Snyder Cut or Justice League, the studio were going to sack Snyder and give the franchise to Hamada and New Line. That had already been decided. I know that for a fact, by the way. Things were in place during Wonder Woman. Things were going to change. A studio wants good movies that can sell. And as much as I admire Zack, he was too divisive to the consumer. It ended up being a situation where you keep on putting down ineffective cement that won't stick. They had no choice but to break the seal. In closing, I do blame Christopher Nolan for not just being honest and saying, look, I can't commit to this. Then they could have given it to someone else. The studio will put. Let me start again. I can't commit to this. Then they could have given it to someone else. The studio will put in an impossible situation, and the buck goes beyond them. Right, I hope my reading out wasn't too bad. I got a bit stuck there near the end. But basically, what I'm saying, this is a video in defense of Warner Brothers. I blame Christopher Nolan. Now, we've all been in our Zack Snyder bubble. It's Geoff Johns' fault. It's that other guy's fault. It's his fault. It's her fault. Diane Nelson was trolled until she left Twitter, for Christ's sake. It's been ridiculous. You know me, guys. I love Man of Steel. I love BVS. I absolutely do. But I'm putting my head in this video above the bubble to speak some honesty. Who's speaking for the hardcore DC fans who don't want Man of Steel, who don't want Batman v Superman, who don't want what they got? Who speaks for them? As I say, I love those films, and I always love those films, and I always watch those films, and those films are now linked to this franchise, right? But those films were divisive. Those films drove the hardcore audiences that you need away. And I'm not blaming Jeff Johns. I'm not blaming Warner Brothers. I'm not blaming anyone at that studio. I'm blaming Christopher Nolan. And Warner Brothers were in a very hard situation because once he came in to have this overseeing Godfather role and he brought in the people he wanted to run it because he wasn't going to be around. He couldn't commit to it. He should never have been involved with it. He should have been honest with Warner Brothers. But by the time he brings in Snyder and Goyer and they're running it and we're already at Suicide Squad, right? There's already a problem. What do Warner Brothers do? Cancel the whole franchise and start again after 3 films? It's an admittance of failure, and studios don't like to admit they failed because they're in the public eye and they've got to look strong. Otherwise, they're going to go out of business. So they were in big trouble. So then, because Jeff Johns was on the outside. He was there, but he was on the outside during Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. He didn't agree with what was happening. You know, this is a legendary, iconic comic book man who sees the universe in a certain way. And this was sacrilege to him, that they wouldn't even listen to his advice. So the truth of the matter is, when you get to Wonder Woman, when he's running things, right, things end up a lot better. That's the fact. So what went wrong with Justice League is not at Jeff Johns' door. It's a culmination of faults. It's a culmination of faults because by that moment, you know, Warner Brothers know they're going to get a divisive Justice League movie that everyone's going to bitch about. They're in trouble. So they panic and they bring in Joss Whedon to lighten it up. The problem they had, because they had to rush it out, look, they made the mistake. They should have bit the bullet and either said, you know, obviously they weren't clear. They weren't happy with what Snyder had done. They got him to rewrite his original script with Terrio. They were not happy. They should have just binned him and binned the movie and said, you know what, just go and make your own Justice League film. Just do your own film, and we're just gonna delay this film, right? We're just gonna delay this film, you can go back and take 2 years to do this film. Of course, that's a problem as well, because what do you do with Superman? He's now dead. So Superman would have to carry on being dead for a little more. But even that could have been handled. That could have been handled via Aquaman, Shazam, and the other movie. It could have been, you know, shouting out Superman. He was a great hero. Maybe Shazam, in his lowest point, goes and stands by Superman's own grave. And in the end, you have kind of a rebirth thing. But the rebirth thing should never have been in a Justice League movie anyway. That was flawed thinking. That should have been in a Man of Steel sequel. It should have been in his own film. You can't do a Superman rebirth story justice, right, within a Justice League film. Or the Justice League film has to be the rebirth story. There can't be any Steppenwolf. There can't be anyone. It just must be about Superman. It must be about these 5 versions who are around when Superman's supposed to be dead. You have to do it like that. It's up to you. But the whole thing is problematic anyway because you killed Superman off in the second film, right? Now, I like the death. I find the death really effective. But you've got to have a good plan. The truth is that Zack Snyder is a great director and a unique storyteller. But is he someone who can come up with a good slate, with a good plan? Is that within his skill set? I don't think so. So this is the problem. But this is what Christopher Nolan brought Zack Snyder in as a filmmaker. I don't think he really thought it through. Is this guy really able to do what Feige has done at the MCU? And I'm not talking about tones. I'm talking about having slates, being able to come out and excite people, you know, being able to run things, not just be a filmmaker, but run things. And basically, nobody knew who was in charge. Then, of course, because the consumer didn't like Snyder, they blamed Snyder for Superman killing Zod. When actually that nail should have been hammered into David S. Goyer's door. So these are all problematic situations, and it all goes back to Warner Brothers' decision to bring in Christopher Nolan to run this franchise. But he didn't have the inspiration or the commitment to do so, so he brought other people in. So All of this is at Christopher Nolan's door. All this could have been avoided if Christopher Nolan hadn't actually agreed to do anything with this franchise. He should say, look, guys, I admire you, I respect you, but I can't do this. I'm assuming Warner Brothers were really coming at him strong. And in the end, I think that's where the problem was. So, when you look at the Snyder era of the DCEU, the problems were there because, really, the company, the studio, didn't want Zack Snyder. He didn't want David Esquire to run this. And they wanted Christopher Nolan to mould a franchise. They saw what he did with The Dark Knight, and they thought, this guy's a genius. He can knit together a great franchise. And he could have done. But at the end of the day, Warner Brothers wanted Harrods, right? And instead, they got Oxfam, right? So I'm not putting Zack Snyder down here, but that's not what they wanted. They wanted Christopher Nolan to run this franchise. So ultimately, they're backpedaling throughout every movie because every movie is not to the consumer's interest. Some of the consumers are loving it. I love it. I love Zack Snyder. But ultimately, you have to put the blame on Christopher Nolan's door because he just says no. They can just bring, whoever they want in. And things wouldn't have been like this. But then we wouldn't have seen Man of Steel. We wouldn't have seen Batman v Superman. And of course, that would have been a shame. And really, this is my opinion on the whole of the beginning of the DCEU. Who's in charge? Who's running it? Who's doing the slates? Who is running this thing? We know who's running the MCU. Well, now we know who's running it, don't we? It's Walter Hamada. His second in command is Peter Safran, and they're doing all this through the New Line Cinema kind of logo. They're making low-budget movies, but The Flash will not be a low-budget movie. So what you've got now is, because Zack Snyder was fired, let's be honest about it, you've got a situation which they shouldn't have done. You've got this situation with the Snyder Cut, and you've got Snyder stands going around stirring up with the new plans, trying to put down what Matt Reeves is doing and what Todd Phillips is doing, because Todd Phillips is very much like Christopher Nolan. Because Todd Phillips isn't a comic book fan, but he's taking a character like the Joker and he's doing something. He's moulding something together here. And I'm quite convinced with this dark label, this black label, even though Joaquin Phoenix is only playing the Joker once, you will see echoes of that film within the DC Black kind of era. It's going to be very exciting. These are great ideas that the public are going to jump at once they see this Joker movie. Meanwhile, they can reconstruct this DCEU to be the film franchise the public want. Yes, the mainstream audience, the main proportion of the audience are the most important entity because as a company, they will make you a lot of money. And if they think you're listening, they'll be on your side. So I'm always perplexed when I hear people say, Warner Brothers don't support director-driven movies. They've been driving director-driven movies since the studio was created by Warner Brothers, the two brothers who founded the company. Oliver Stone's JFK is the most controversial film they've ever produced. Oliver Stone and Kevin Costner, the lead of that film, were both threatened. And I'm not talking about death threats that reality stars moan about on Twitter. I'm talking about getting sent bullets, real fucking death threats. So don't tell me Warner Brothers don't support the filmmaker. That's fake news. What happened here was the story of the Snyder era of the DCEU, and I always love it. I always love what Zack did, is a company wanting Christopher Nolan to get the clay and mould a franchise because they knew he could do it. And if that was the case, I think that people wouldn't even be talking about the MCU right now. Avengers Endgame wouldn't have got anywhere near $2 billion at the box office. It would now be the DCEU, which will be lauded and talked about. Because Warner Brothers didn't want Zack Snyder to run their franchise. They wanted Christopher Nolan. But in the end, because they were between a rock and a hard place. It's Zack Snyder. It's David S. Goyer. It's Jeff Johns. It's this one. It's that one. Who's running this thing? Because they're trying to get themselves out of a hole. They can't just destroy the whole franchise. They have to rebuild it. And they didn't know what to do. And I think the best thing they did in the end was bring in Walter Hamada and New Line Cinema. That's working for me. We now know who's running this thing. We know what kind of shape. And it's an exciting shape. Starting off with the Joker movie. And that excites me. That interests me. Because, as I said, Warner Brothers never wanted Zack Snyder. They wanted Christopher Nolan. And that, my friends, is the crux of why and where and when the Snyder situation went awry. What happened to his daughter, Autumn, was tragic, was devastating. But it happened. Warner Brothers can't be responsible for that. Warner Brothers mustn't be blamed for that. I like Warner Brothers. They're always going to be my studio. But like all studios these days, they make mistakes. And their mistake was to say to Christopher Nolan, look, Chris, you're not committed. We can't do this. We must have someone who's going to mould this together. But you see, they were worried about Christopher Nolan because Christopher Nolan had just made the Dark Knight trilogy. He was their golden goose. And they wanted to do films with him in the future. So they were between a rock and a hard place. They had to go with what he wanted. He wanted Snyder, no interference for Man of Steel. No, you're staying out there. Warner Brothers, you're not getting involved. We know you're nervous. You have a right to be nervous, but you brought me in, and this is the guy I want. This is what happens. Batman v Superman, that's when it started, when Warner Brothers got involved. And I think this is why we got the Ultimate Edition in the end. And I think WB only allowed that edition to be released because they wanted to make some extra bucks. But thankfully they did. They interfered. They interfered because they were afraid. They interfered because they weren't going to make the money a Batman v Superman movie could make. People are talking to me about 850 million, nearly 900 million. That's a great amount of money. That is a great amount of money, but not for a Superman and a Batman film. A Superman and a Batman film should be making Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame money. In fact, Avengers Endgame and Infinity War combined money. And that's what a Justice League movie can make. And done to the perfections and tastes of the bigger audience, that is what you can make. There's so much potential to make great DC movies. And I'll repeat again before you go in on me, I love Zack Snyder and I love his films, but they didn't work. They didn't work for the audience that the studio who owns the rights to this. It's easy to blame the studio. It's easy to say they got this wrong. Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they keep faith with Zack Snyder? Well, they did. They kept faith with Zack Snyder with Watchmen. They kept faith with Zack Snyder with Man of Steel. By Batman v Superman, they weren't keeping faith with him anymore because they knew the audience didn't want that. Even when he was announced for Man of Steel, and I'm getting a sore throat now talking too much, but even when he was announced for Man of Steel, the negative reaction to it was very hardcore. And I didn't even know who he was then. And then I realised he did 300 and Watchmen. I thought, well, I like those movies. That's awesome. But many people weren't happy. So I thought, we're going to have a problem here. But I started seeing the trailers for Man of Steel, and it looked amazing. And I really enjoyed the movie. I saw it in the cinema 3 times. But superhero movies are massive now. Massive. They're a big deal. They're big bucks. And there is no reason why a DC world of movies can't be as successful as the MCU with the plan that Walter Hamada has. It's going to take time to get that trust back, although I think Joker movie will have a really positive response. I think this is something extremely special. This is what Warner Brothers does best. We're not Disney. We're Warner Brothers. And we make real movies about people that hit home. So when you come out of the cinema, like I did when I saw the test screening, right, or the place where I went to, right, it affected me. It affected me for weeks and weeks and weeks. I got it. I knew something special had happened. That's the kind of films Warner Brothers have always made. Warner Brothers must make Warner Brothers movies. Stick to your strengths, and you can have the bestest DC franchise ever. The decision to back Ezra Miller when he didn't like what the Spider-Man Homecoming writer-directors were doing. Now, I know a lot of people have said, here we go again, Warner Brothers interfering with directors, not letting them do what they want. At the end of the day, they allowed Zack Snyder to do what he wanted with Man of Steel. And as much as I love that movie, that had negative consequences, didn't it? They saw a situation coming awry. It was one of their starred Golden Goose actors or two directors who were never going to work with them again. Let's be honest. Or maybe they would have done, right? They did Game Night for them, didn't they? Right? So then maybe they would have worked for them. But it was either them. And at the end of the day, I've heard what Ezra's got to say. He wants an awesome love letter to the fans. He wants to make a Flash movie that we want to see, the people that have read DC Comics The Flash and have enjoyed it. Now, the Game Night directors, the Spider-Man Homecoming directors, didn't want to do that. So it was right that they went. And now, we're going to have a great writer adapt Ezra Miller's and the comic book legend script. We're already seeing what Ava DuVernay is doing with Tom King, another legendary comic book writer. Things are changing at DC. Comic book writers working with a studio to create the best DC Comics movies and platforms possible. That's a great thing. So I say I respect Zack Snyder. I want to see the Snyder Cut. I really do. But this dream that some of you have got, the Stans, because I'm not a Stan. I like the guy. I like what he did with MOS and BBS, but I'm not a Stan. The dream that you have that he's got to come back and carry on his vision, it's done. He proved, or the audience proved, that that's not what they wanted. And at the end of the day, the majority of your customer is always right. That's what this industry is all about. So I look at the past, and there's a lot of divisiveness, negativity. But I will say this. For me, Man of Steel and Batman v Superman sit in a prideful position within the DCEU. The DCEU will always reference them because they're great movies. They just weren't for everyone. That's life. I'm sure that these DC world of movies going forward will still not make $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. But ultimately, what's going to happen is we have a brighter future. See you in the next video.